My name is Stephen Parkinson. I'm the president of White Hat, and I will be giving a talk tonight about Mac file systems and APFS security. So first about me, I'm a fourth year software engineer. I own two home bricks now. I was very against them at first, but they are very useful, and I need one in every room of my house now. So yeah, it's fine. It's not an addiction. Um, yeah, so a little overview of the talk. It's going to be, first of all, just like what is a file system. It'll be real short. A little bit of a history. We're going through some of the classic Mac OS stuff, and then what we had before APFS, and then talking about APFS and what it uh, built on top, or what it added to that legacy stuff, and what makes it better than it. So first of all, what is a file system? Well, basically it controls how data is stored on your computer. They're stored in files usually, because file system. Usually has some kind of management features that can give you like information about the allocated and available space, and then other things like that you would want to manage a physical drive, whether that be a hard drive or an SSD. And then also file names specifically, they can be case sensitive or, well, file systems can be case sensitive, which basically means that if you have a file named something like capital F file, that is different than a lowercase f file. So basically just there's case sensitive and case insensitive file systems. It doesn't really matter for anything specifically here. And then also it keeps track of metadata for all the files and other information relating to the files in the system. Yeah, so we're going to start with classic Mac OS. A little bit of background on it. It was released in 1984 with the original Macintosh. It lacked protected memory and preemptive multitasking. Protected memory is role important because otherwise any application running on your system can read and write all of memory. So there was some cool stuff you could do with customization back in the classic Mac OS days, like because everything was in memory, you could just modify it and customize anything you wanted in the system. Apple has really locked down that kind of stuff since those days. And then yeah, also it lacked preemptive multitasking, which basically for a while you could only run one program on a Mac at a time. And then they introduced something called Multi-Finder, which basically added cooperative multitasking, which basically is the computer gives control, or the OS gives control to a program, and then it's up to that program to give back control to the OS. So if you had a malicious program, it could just take control and keep it forever, because why would the OS need to get it back? Yeah, so I think that was introduced in System 2, and then it was a feature you could add in System 2, and then in System 5 it became a default addition. And we didn't get true preemptive multitasking until Mac OS 10 in 2001. Yeah, so the first Mac used MFS, which is Macintosh File System. It was designed for floppy disks. It was used in System 1 and 2. It's a flat file system, meaning that there was no folders. Although Finder could, as you can see in that picture, it can fake folders, like there's a system folder and that empty folder. But the way it was doing that is just with files and data within the files telling the finder where to put things, basically. File names could be 255 characters long. They were limited to 63 by finder. So I guess they never ran into issues because they just had finder limit the file name length. Yeah, so it could address about 20 megabytes or 1,400 files, which is essentially nothing in today's world, but this was in '84, so that was plenty back then. And it was all on a floppy disk, so, and those were nowhere near 20 megabytes. Yeah, and then that empty folder, it always existed because there was no real way to make a folder. If you created a folder, or if you renamed that folder, the system would just create another folder called empty folder, called empty folder. And then, yeah, you can just keep going down the line. So there was always an empty folder, which honestly, if I had been using that system, that would be really annoying to me because I would not want to have an empty folder there all the time. Yeah, and then support for MFS was dropped in System 8. Yeah, so basically the only way to, and I think at that point it was read-only anyway. I don't believe you could write to it. And there is actually still software available. I don't know if it works with Big Sur or like the Catalina or Big Sur. They did some weird stuff with system extensions. But there is still software available that lets you read MFS if you ever stumble across an MFS drive. So then we had HFS, which is the hierarchical file system, which I will only refer to as HFS from now on because that name is real hard to say. Anyway, yeah, it was introduced in System 2.1. It includes a catalog file, which basically just it includes, yeah. So basically, it's a way for the system to keep track of where stuff is a lot more efficiently than they were doing with MFS. It is a proprietary file system. However, it is really well documented, and there are a lot of third-party tools that exist for support on Windows or Linux and stuff like that. So there are, even though it is proprietary, there are ways to read it on other systems. Yeah, so this file system was limited to around 6,500, or sorry, 65,000 files on a disk. So a lot more than the 1,400 that you had with MFS. And then Snow Leopard, so macOS 10.6, dropped write support. And Snow Leopard dropped write support. So Leopard and before, you could still write to an HFS disk. However, with macOS 10, you were no longer able to boot an HFS disk because they added HFS Plus, which came out with in '98 with the first iMac, and it was used until High Sierra. So this file system lasted a long time. Like we are on, it was around until about 2016, 2017 with High Sierra, or sorry, Sierra, because it was dropped until, yeah. Anyway, yeah, so it had smaller block sizes, which basically allows for more efficient use of the disk space. Basically, if you have a really, really small file, it takes up less space because the block size that you're writing to the disk is a lot smaller. It was also updated to allow it to address around 4.3 billion files, or 2 to the 32 minus 1. And volumes can be 8 exabytes. So a little bit bigger than what we currently have, but yeah, useful to have expansion options in the future. Yeah, so basically, smaller block sizes was better for larger hard drives. Yeah, that screenshots from my Mac Mini, which is still running High Sierra because it's from 2010, so it's EOL, but it's fine. I still love it. Yeah, so there were some attempts to replace HFS Plus in the past, before APFS. In 2006, there was a push to adopt ZFS in macOS, but that was dropped. 2007 to 2011, there were 2 rumored projects within Apple to create a new file system. But obviously, well, not obviously, I guess both of those got canceled. So there wasn't any progress there. And then in 2011, we did get something called core storage, which is basically a layer between the physical disk and the file system itself. So you have your physical disk, and then you have core storage on top of that, and then core storage is what's actually talking to HFS. Yeah, so basically, it's a shim between the two. It handled fusion drives. So if you remember, when iMacs had both an SSD and I guess it probably wasn't only iMacs, but I know it from the iMac, had both an SSD and a hard drive. Core storage is what handled that and made it look like the computer only had 1 disk, even though it actually has 2. And then it also handled FileVault. So all of the encryption for HFS wasn't handled by the file system itself. Rather, it was going through core storage. So, yeah. And at this point, in 2011, HFS is already, HFS Plus is old. And clearly they're looking for something to replace it. So what do we have? APFS. It's the default file system starting from iOS 10.3 and macOS High Sierra. It includes a lot of new features, such as flexible volumes, and yeah, it allocates storage on demand, which is fun for quotas and stuff. And you might be thinking, why APFS? Why is the P in there? Well, AFS is actually Andrew file system. Very, very well known, as I'm sure all of you have heard of that before. More realistically, it's also the Apple file, it's the Apple File Service, which is the service that implements the Apple filing protocol, which is Apple's like network file sharing protocol. So like the SMB of Apple. It's also really old, so don't use it anymore. Yeah, so yeah, why do we need this? Well, it's 64-bit. As I mentioned, HFS Plus was 32-bit. So 64-bit allows for more files and smaller chunk sizes on larger volumes because it can address, or it can keep track of many more files than HFS Plus. It's also been optimized for SSDs, so it does a lot of like a lot of efficiency things that you wouldn't be able to do with a hard drive. It also includes something called copy on write, which basically, when you copy a file, when you duplicate a file, it doesn't take up more storage. Rather, it just points the duplicate at the same blocks as the original. And then what happens when you write to the file is that it will, depending on which one you change, it will map those chunks of the file to different areas. And this is really nice for saving storage. However, it does fragment files like a lot. So that's kind of like an SSD specific like feature, because on a hard drive, having the head seek a lot is really inefficient. On a SSD, it's a lot faster. It's still not great, but it is a lot faster, even if the blocks are spread out. It also includes more robust encryption and reserve and quota sizes, which I will get into later because they're pretty fun. Yeah, so snapshots also. If you were at my iOS security and jailbreaking talk, you might remember I mentioned snapshots really briefly. Snapshots on iOS are actually used to restore the system to a read-only state every boot. So basically, all a snapshot is a picture of all of the files on an APFS volume. It basically just takes it takes a picture of all the files, and then as files change, the snapshot doesn't change, but the files themselves do because of the copy on write stuff. And they're stored in the same container as the volume. So basically just it's stored on the same disk as the APFS volume itself. And if you reboot into recovery mode, you can actually restore 2 local snapshots that your Mac has just taken by itself. Like I listed all of the local snapshots that were on my drive at the time. And it's just kind of, it does that in the background, even if you don't have Time Machine turned on, I believe. I'm not 100% on that. I think it does. But those do take up some storage. So like the meme text says, if you have a lot of like other storage in the little storage bar that you can see from about this Mac storage, deleting the local snapshots is something that might recover some of that other space, because sometimes that's hard to track down what that actually is. Yeah, so also encryption, it's no longer a shim underneath the file system. It's integrated to the core of it. You can have encrypted startup volumes. So like pretty much every Mac that has, well, yeah, there's, so yeah, you can have an encrypted startup volume. That's about it for that. FileVault specifically, yeah.
Real quick. So I had a question about, can you go back to the previous slide real quick?
maybe, yes.
So can you kind of elaborate on what you mean by it's more integrated, like in comparison to how it was encrypted before? Like, what do
Yeah,
you mean by it's
so basically, the way that HFS worked is that it had that core storage layer below the file system itself. So basically, there was an extra there. HFS was really old in 2011 already, so most likely the people working on it weren't at Apple anymore. So instead of going into the HFS plus code itself, they just wrote a layer to slap underneath it. And we're like, here, we do encryption now. Um, so basically, what I'm trying to get at with integrated is that it was something that they considered while they were creating the file system rather than having to tack it on with some other um, with some other kind of system
hmm
afterwards.
And would you say that's like a more, I guess, I don't know if sustainable is the right word, but like, is that like a good choice in the long term?
I think, yeah, I think overall it's probably better. I don't know whether or not it's like more sustainable or not, because obviously that you're adding more complexity to the file system itself. So I'm not sure if in another 20 years, or well, I guess less 15, 20 years, I don't know if we're going to see another file system because all the people working on APFS have left Apple or what. But yeah, I think they also might have had more consideration into the design of the file system and how they are writing it. Because I don't, because it is used everywhere. Um, like when they were designing HFS, the iPhone didn't exist. And now that this, like APFS is used in every iPhone, every Mac, every iPad, every device that Apple makes uses APFS.
Mhm.
So they, unless they want to do another transition like this, they need to have done a better job in creating it and being able to maintain and build upon that file system, which
Okay.
they have been. To be fair, they have been adding a lot of features since it was introduced. So it seems like they're keeping on the path.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So encrypted startup volume, FileVault. You should all have this turned on. If you don't, turn it on, please. Uh, yeah, basically, it requires your password when you boot your computer. It it worked obviously with HFS Plus because we had FileVault starting with Panther, but yeah, it's just more integrated now, and especially with the M1 and the T2, you get encryption by default because the M1 or the T2 do the, or because they're the drive controller, they, as they're writing to the physical disk in your computer, are encrypting the data that they are writing. So basically, what that means is that if someone were to physically take the like chips out of your computer, read all of the data off of them, they still wouldn't be able to read the data on there. Even if you don't have FileVault on, they wouldn't be able to read the data. You should still have FileVault turned on because it's better, but yeah, it's tied to your physical hardware. Like it's yeah, it's some fancy stuff. Yeah. Um, like yeah, like I said, even without FileVault, the APFS volumes are still encrypted, but Uh, yeah. So this is another fun thing that um, APFS allowed Apple to do. Basically, system integrity protection limits the uh, access that you have to critical system files and also not so critical system files. Basically, anything that's distributed with macOS is a system file. So all the bundled applications and stuff like that are read only and you cannot modify them. And then in 10.15, Catalina, they were split into two two drives actually. So this is where APFS comes into play for SIP. So in Catalina, there's a read-only system volume and a read and write data volume that includes all of the user's data. And the way they do this is with volume groups, which are an APFS feature. And the volume group shares encryption state, and basically, if your system volume is encrypted, then your data volume is as well. And for all intents and purposes, these two volumes show up to a user as one volume. In most cases, there is some weird stuff that you can do that will get it to be weird, but for any normal user, it's going to seem like the computer still has one volume that it's storing all of the data on. And that's thanks to firm links, which basically are just a mapping of a folder to another folder, and they are designed to be traversed either direction. That's about it. They're like fancy, I guess. I don't know. They're fine. They seem to work. Yeah, so then actually, in Big Sur, we got something even more than that. I had actually forgotten about it until I went to look at my disk and disk utility today. And I was like, oh yeah, they added snapshots to macOS. So yeah, macOS now basically does the same thing that iOS does, where it has a snapshot of the system, and then instead of actually booting off of like the disk itself, it's just loading the snapshot and then booting off of the snapshot. So it's not necessarily more secure, but just an interesting thing that they changed. And yeah, it seems like our Macs are getting more iOS-y by the day, which I'm not opposed to. Apple Silicon. Woo. Yeah, so then reserve and quota sizes are something that I had mentioned earlier. This isn't so much a security thing, it's just kind of like a fun thing that APFS allows you to do. I'm sure other file systems allow you to do it too, because it seems like a real nice feature. But specifically with APFS, it's really nice or really easy to create volumes that share a container. So if you wanted, say, a 5 gig volume for where your photo library lives, you could create that. And then with the quota size, you can actually limit it to only 5 gigs. So it'll look to photos as if your drive only has 5 gigs and it can only expand up to 5 gigs. So your photo library won't balloon out to like 50 gigs like mine. And yeah, fun stuff. And then reserve size, basically, because all of the volumes are sharing a container, they're sharing disk space. If you have a volume that you know will need a certain amount of space, you can give it a reserve size. So it will allocate that space for that volume so that no other volumes can use it. And even with a reserve size, your drive can get, or your that volume can go above the reserve size, assuming that it doesn't also have a quota. Yeah, other fun things. In Big Sur, they added a feature that basically allows APFS to compute the deltas between files like way faster than they were in the past. What that allows you to do is to do time machine deltas really fast also. So when it's, if you've ever backed up with time machine, I'm sure you've seen the like, oh God, what is it? Preparing backup, I think. Um, Basically what it's doing then is trying to calculate what has changed between the last time you backed up and now. So I should have looked up the statistics for this because they're actually, it's really impressive. It's gone from like that taking hours to like minutes, or like an hour to like 5 minutes. It's like a really big improvement. So if you are using Time Machine, would recommend using an using an APFS drive for Time Machine, because it's going to be a lot faster. The only caveat with that, if you are using a hard drive, it will be slower to write because APFS is specifically designed to work well on SSDs. You are taking about a 15% hit on hard drive speed compared to HFS, but the amount of time you save from the deltas is most likely going to be more time saved than the actual writing of the files, because the writing of the files doesn't take that long after the first backup. The first backup will take a long time, but after the first one, most files don't change that much. So yeah, and then these are some of the resources that I got this information from. One of them is a Facebook video, which I didn't realize because I downloaded these over summer. And then I went to find the sources today and I was like, oh, it was a Facebook video. Interesting. Must have been when I had a Facebook account. Yeah, so that's about it. Are there any questions?
Do you happen to know if if APFS is, if there's an implementation for APFS on any system that's not a Mac?
I believe there's a company called Paragon that has done, or they do stuff with, I know they had an HFS driver for Windows, and I believe a while back they had an APFS one in beta. I don't know whether or not that ever got released or not. I assume it did. So yeah, I believe there are some third-party implementations of it, but it is obviously, it's newer than HFS, so it's less documented still.